So this is my 50 states in 30 minutes presentation, but I'm going to do it in less because I'm sure you all are hungry. And also Jeremy did such a superb job in the morning that he's teed a lot of these issues up for me. So the idea here, and the Energy Storage Association, I'll give you a bit of background about us. We are the National Trade Association for Energy Storage. We represent approximately 170 members. The membership varies between utilities, developers, independent power producers, and manufacturers who are deploying storage. And we represent all technologies, so from pumped hydro and flywheels on the one end to ice storage and batteries on the other end. Here are some of our members. So today's goal is to give you a sense of how ESA, from a policy perspective, when we're engaging in the 50 states, think about the market and regulatory hurdles to energy storage, and then give you a sense of what some of the leading states on these issues are doing, and hopefully that toolbox and all the policies in the toolbox can help animate a discussion about what would be useful from a policy perspective for Michigan to consider. So I'll start here. Here are the three key themes from a regulatory challenge perspective: value, competition, and access. And I'll break down these three categories. I'll explain why these are important, why you should care about these, and then what are states doing to try and overcome some of these issues. And the idea is just, we should see energy storage. Why aren't we seeing energy storage? Well, you can break it down in most situations to value, competition, and access. So I'll start with value. Jeremy mentioned a couple of different elements that are helpful and important to think about in terms of value, resilience, and the like. I think that the way to best think about value and as a challenge, as a regulatory and market challenge, is that there are some values that we know as a society or as a ratepayer might care about, but there's no current mechanism to capture that value, monetize that value. Sometimes it's values that we can give a dollar amount to. Sometimes it's values that are really hard to quantify. But we know collectively that we want to be moving towards those values and recognizing and realizing those values. And so overcoming those hurdles for storage is important. So what do I mean by that? I use this graphic a lot. It's from the Massachusetts State of Charge report, which you should all go read if you haven't yet. But think about the economic value here. Jeremy mentioned a lot about resilience. I know we'll talk a lot about that today. Economic productivity. Of all the commodities in the United States, they all have stored inventory capacity of usually around 10% of daily consumption. Oil, gas, natural gas, gasoline, water, food. You have that buffer. You can withstand the normal vicissitudes of the day, changes in supply and demand, and then shocks to the system a little bit more. And so the impacts on economic productivity of not having stored inventory in the electric sector has an impact. It's hard to value, but we know it's there. So let's think about whether or not there are mechanisms to overcome some of this, capture the value that can provide. Here are some other values to think about. This is also the Massachusetts State of Charge. They tried to capture the monetary value that can be provided by energy storage deployment. They've reached the optimal size of costs, if you think about the costs and the benefits, of 1,700 megawatts of storage. And you can see a lot of it's addressing peak capacity. So this is something that's really important. When you don't have inventory, you have to overbuild to be able to capture a lot of the unexpected changes that are to come. Energy storage can provide a little bit of savings there that we should be thinking about. For the State of Charge report, 40% of that savings is in peak capacity. So these, I won't go into it, but these are some of the values that we can see energy storage can provide. Do we see any of the regulatory hurdles that prevent energy storage from delivering these for us to capture that value and provide that revenue stream? And how do we make sure that we're creating opportunities for that value to be provided and monetized? So here is a list of different kinds of policies that states have been considering to address the energy storage value proposition and make sure that the regulatory and market rules are in place to actually recognize that value. That's happening in a lot of ways by setting storage targets, setting incentives to help deploy those resources so that we can work on the long-term planning and regulatory reform that's needed to make sure that there's actually a mechanism for capturing that value. So it's recognizing there's a value there. I know what it is. I'm going to spend a long time trying to figure out what that dollar amount is and how to capture that value in a regulatory and market way. But in the meantime, let's get things going. And so incentives and procurement targets have been something that's that a number of states have started to do. They also usually are predicated on a cost-benefit study, which is very important. It's a state-specific study that gives you a really good sense of what these potential values could be and what the cost could be, and help you find optimal deployment levels to work towards. So you see Massachusetts, New York, Nevada, Maryland, North Carolina have completed their studies. Virginia and New Jersey and Colorado are in the middle of it. Let me show you how that translated to state actions in terms of targets. For those studies, California set a target without a study. Nevada just concluded that 1,000 megawatts by 2030 are in the public interest, and they're implementing that. New York, Massachusetts, and New Jersey have also implemented storage targets based on their studies. And then Arizona has proposed a target and is deliberating it at the commission. They don't have a study underpinning that, but that's the beginning of a conversation in Arizona. I'll note that all the targets are very different. It also will differ if it's a regulatory or what the regulatory context is. So if you're in a restructured state, a target's going to look a lot different than if you're a vertically integrated state. It's going to look a lot different if you have some wholesale market opportunities for storage versus not. So these are not all equal, but they are certainly recognizing that there's a value there that they want to work towards, and so they set the targets, and that's been an effective way of getting the market going. Storage incentives, Jeremy also had a slide on that. I'll make note that there's various, most of these incentives have been focused on solar plus storage, and they're mostly focused on behind the meter, with the exception of New York, where there is a bulk system incentive to complement a procurement target of 350 megawatts for bulk system procurement from the distribution utilities. Okay, so that was value. Competition. Competition is the idea that if the playing field is not level, where your technology, energy storage, or otherwise can compete with other traditional resources, there's no way for that resource to ever be built. So a lot of these regulatory reforms are actually about making sure that you define the rules and build the rules in a way that actually lets the storage assets compete with other traditional resources. That doesn't mean that a specific need or specific application they're always going to win, as the previous panel discussed, but that does mean that if you don't break down the barriers for participation both in the regulatory process and in the market, you'll never find out whether that resource can actually offer you the benefits you need for potentially less money. So competition is really important, and that's why you should care about it. Jeremy talked a lot about integrated resource planning, so I'm not going to exhaust this, but from our perspective, competition, and in the context here, integrated resource planning is important, and the Commission's already doing a lot on that, and the utilities. So here are some of the tools in the competition toolbox. Again, I'll echo that integrated resource planning, distribution resource planning, a very important way of making sure that you're breaking down the rules, leveling the playing field so that there can be competition for these technologies, so that no matter what the price is, they won't be able to compete if the process isn't there to capture what they can do. All right. Here are some states that are doing a lot on this integrated resource planning side. As I mentioned Michigan in December 2017 issued an order calling in consideration of energy storage in the 2019 IRPs. Similarly, Washington in their policy statement, back when Jeremy was working there in October of 2017, issued a policy statement calling for effective modeling and consideration of storage in their resource planning. Arizona rejected the ACC rejected the utility IRPs for lack of consideration of storage for the 2017 IRPs, and they put a moratorium in place for new build natural gas of 150 megawatts or more until they've reformed their energy rules to better capture new technologies. And I've also called out a number of Colorado. There's a bill this year that passed by Representative Hansen that called on the Commission to reform all their resource planning rules and all their utility planning all the utility rules. So integrated resource planning, distribution resource planning, and CPCN and transmission, all to better include energy storage. And Commissioner Ackerman just completed an order on that in December. And then I have to call out, aside from all the utilities that we called out on the graphic that are looking at new and innovative ways of capturing energy storage in their IRPs, NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Commission, yeah, there we go. Utility commissions, there we go, issued a very important resolution in November calling for the very same thing that I've just been talking about. So there's definitely a lot of people thinking about how to do this and a lot of great minds and commissioners thinking about this. All right, access. How am I doing on time? I'm doing pretty well. Okay, so access is really important for a number of reasons. Number one, first and foremost, if you put all of this money into an incentive program, or if you've put all of these resources into making sure that energy storage can be deployed, but it actually can't interconnect into the system, then that was a waste of everybody's time and money. And so access is often the least sexy topic that I talk about with policymakers and regulators, but it's actually really important because you really need to make sure that you have the access piece right. Another really important one, and Scott from PJM talked about this, is applications, making sure that you're able to provide from the same asset a number of applications. This is not only a retail, can you provide retail services and wholesale market services at the same time, but can you provide the same multiple services from the same assets even at the distribution level? The reason why this is considered access and this is important is that if you have this one asset and it can only serve one application, that's usually bad from a ratepayer's perspective because that asset is leaving value on the table for ratepayers. But the second reason that's really important, and then it's also not providing those values, and so you have to go find another asset and pay for it at the same time with ratepayer funds rather than using the same one. Similarly, from an economics perspective, if you can capture multiple value streams and you can capture revenues for multiple applications, then the economics for more systems pencil out, and then you have more deployment for less money. So obviously, access and the multiple use applications component of it is really important. So let me talk about what states are doing on that. And I mentioned, so this is the idea of, I hate using the word value stack because it's overused, but maybe in this crowd it's new, so I'll just make sure that I articulate it again. So if you can recognize that a storage asset can provide multiple services, you want to make sure that that same asset has the ability from a regulatory perspective to actually do that. Can it participate in a demand response program if it's also doing net metering? So just making sure that the regulatory framework is there to allow that asset to provide all of these services. If it's providing a retail service benefit, can it also then provide a wholesale market benefit? This is a very complicated issue. It's being dealt with at wholesale markets and by regulators, so I'm not trivializing it, but it's really important that we get this right. And then just to look at your kind of access toolbox, here are some of the options. So distribution interconnection, very important. And I think 9 states, I forgot to include the slide on here, but there's about 9 states, including the state of Michigan, who've launched a stakeholder process to review distribution interconnection rules to make sure that they are accurately capturing energy storage behavior so that you don't have unnecessarily long or costly interconnection studies for behavior that's not actually going to show up. So distribution interconnection is a big one. As I mentioned, you have an incentive program, great, but if you can't interconnect, and we're seeing this actually in Massachusetts, where Massachusetts has just launched the SMART program, a great incentive program design, but because of some metering requirements around utility interconnection, you may very well find that some of these projects don't make it to the finish line. So very important. And then, as I mentioned, multiple use application frameworks. California and New York have both launched stakeholder processes to look at what kind of principles and what kind of reforms are needed to overcome this multiple use challenge. Likewise, FERC has a DER aggregation process that's underway there where stakeholders have filed comments on that. And really the key here is just to make sure that it's state specific, that there's consideration of both what's happening on the wholesale market and also on the regulatory level, but it's not just a wholesale issue. And then I think probably the number one issue that most of these 2 working groups are dealing with is how do you capture the word service? So making sure they don't get compensated twice for the same service. Well, how do you make sure that that happens? So there's a lot of work to be done here, and two states have started on that track. So that is it for me. Yeah, did that faster than I thought.
You stand there, I'm going to sit over here and ask the questions.
Okay.
One of the first questions is, are there concerns being voiced by utilities remaining economically viable in the face of larger scale storage deployments?
Not sure I understood the question. So are there concerns by utilities on,
For remaining economically viable in the face of more storage availability?
like, the value declining as more deployments are?
You asked the question, so.
Yeah, no, I don't know if I haven't heard of that. Maybe I'll leave that to the utilities
Okay.
participating today to voice that, but no, I haven't. I mean, I think that a lot of, when you do a cost benefit study for a state, the value, declining value as more megawatts increase is captured in there. And so if you see a study like New York that says 3,000 megawatts of storage by 2030 provides a net benefit of X million or $billion, in their case it was $2 billion by 2030, that captured that assumption into it, the marginal benefits. So we're still seeing gigawatt scale modeling exercises by robust analysis demonstrate the value even as that natural concept is baked into the studies.
Here's another question. Should we expect to see a very steep negative value curve once storage saturates the market?
Wow, these questions.
These are very, very
I know, I was going to say.
questions. Even before lunch.
I can tell.
They're getting hangry.
Yeah, I can tell. It's funny that a policy conversation has triggered these questions. You know, I just don't feel like we're there yet to have that conversation. I think that the critical element is to make sure that we capture the value correctly, and then we look at the rules that are in place to make sure that we are calling on the market for the kind of products that we want. And the economics and the value, if there's a market price to capture the value, it will let you know what that value is.
I'll give you one last chance.
Yes.
How does the high price end users are willing to pay to avoid service interruptions square with battery storage costs in studies?
Okay. So I have two things to say on that. The first thing is that I don't know if you all read GTM's report it was 2017's report, but 2017 was the first time where behind the meter storage for residential systems actually exceeded non-residential systems. And it was always thought that the commercial storage industry, because of the ability for demand charge mitigation, is going to be much stronger than the residential sector, where the value proposition is more on resilience and backup and a little bit less to capture and monetize. And so the fact that the industry deployment tipped in the favor of residential should humble all of us to realize that there are a lot of things that are not only driven by economics. So definitely there is a sense that there's some value to resilience and backup, particularly for residential systems, that's worth investigating. So I'll just say that, and we're learning a lot about what customer value is for storage, and it's interesting, and I think that our understanding of it is ever evolving. Having said that, I think that there are a lot of applications across the country where energy storage is already cost competitive as a solution today. And so in certain jurisdictions and in certain applications, even sometimes potentially with one application, deferring a submarine transmission line, energy storage pencils out even for 8-hour duration lithium-ion batteries. So I think that what we really need to be thinking about is facilitating multiple applications so that the economics are improved, allowing that facility to serve multiple applications, but also recognizing that there's some value there that we're not capturing, and the more that we incorporate that value into price signals and market design, the more assets you'll see.
Are you familiar with the New Hampshire order?
Liberty?
Okay, so would you comment on that as a closing?
Sure. I hope what they're asking about is a recent settlement, Liberty in New Hampshire proposed to the commission, and the commission agreed to, that would provide behind-the-meter customers with the ability to provide grid services to the utility in exchange for an on-bill credit. I believe that they're called on with 24-hour notice, maybe 4 times a month or something like that. Is that, yeah, anyway, no? And that provides, it provides the customers with an ability to capture yet another value stream by providing grid services to the utility. And the benefit to the utility and to ratepayers is that it can forego distribution investment. And so it's essentially, along the same lines, allowing distributed resources to defer distribution needs, a very innovative policy that we anticipate seeing in a lot of states.
Thank you, Nitsan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.